Hi, I'm Megan. Welcome to today's live reading of Perfectly Framed by Ruth J. Hartman, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Join me. Chapter 1. When a cancellation from a black and white tuxedo cat's mom gave me a break in my cat grooming schedule at Fabulous Felines, I took the opportunity to visit my friend Evan at his photography studio. He'd phoned earlier saying he had proofs of kitty pictures he had taken for some of my clients. I couldn't wait to check them out. And who better to take along with me than my own two felines? A tug came from my fingers. One of my cats, Jasper, was pulling against his harness, ready to run. Percival, his adoptive brother, was finally becoming alert after his long nap. He yawned, licked his paw, then looked up at me as if to say, "Okay, let's do this." The short walk had us there in no time, even with both cats feeling the need to sniff, rub against, or paw at everything that was at their eye level. And that was a lot of things: grass, pebbles, park benches, and cracks in the sidewalk. Nothing was safe from wet kitty noses and twitchy whiskers. When I opened the door to Evan Lake's photography studio, I blinked, always forgetting how dim he kept his main room, with some small spotlights positioned so that his work was beautifully on display and caught the admirer's attention. When my vision adjusted to the low light, a movement caught my eye. It was Evan, who stood near an open doorway to his dark room. "Hi, Evan," I waved. He didn't answer. His usual wide grin, had been replaced with a scrunched brow and a glassy-looking eyes, as if he couldn't focus. Something was wrong. I stepped closer. "Evan, are you all right?" He jerked. Had I startled him? Maybe he hadn't heard me come in, although that seemed odd considering the loud bell on the front door and the sound of my voice. "Oh, Molly?" he asked, like he wasn't quite sure who I might be. Wow, he was really out of it. Concerned, I reached out and touched his arm. "Are you ill? Can I help you?" He shook his head slowly. His throat moved as he swallowed. Maybe he'd gotten some bad news or didn't feel well. "What happened? In there," he whispered, his voice raspy. "What is it?" Now I was really worried. What had I walked into? Evan pointed toward the open doorway. "Something is in there?" I asked. Had an animal gotten in overnight and destroyed his photos? Or maybe our recent rain had caused a roof leak and ruined his beautiful work? What a terrible loss that would be. "No, someone," he said. He took a quick gulp of air. Was he having trouble breathing? Maybe I should take him to see our local doctor. "Evan, do you need to sit down?" I pointed to a grouping of chairs set against his front wall. He shook his head, causing strands of his light-colored hair to brush against his forehead. "Somebody," he shivered, "is in there." So we were back to a person in his dark room, but why weren't they coming out? Is it a customer who... He grabbed my free hand, something he'd never done before, and towed me behind him into the room. I nearly stumbled as he tugged me harder. What was going on? I squinted against the bright lights, such a change from the dim front area. In here, the lights were ablaze, making the term darkroom seem inaccurate. Percival and Jasper's leashes bounced in my other hand as the cats trotted behind me, the shrill sound of their claws scraping against the wood floor planks making me shiver. Evan dropped my hand and then pointed again, this time to his right and toward the floor. What was going on? Was there an injured or ill customer back here? "Evan, I don't right there." I edged closer and then I saw it. Or should I say, saw her, and gasped. Agnes Temple, a woman in her early 60s who was a high school teacher, lay in a crumpled heap beside a counter filled with bins of finished photographs. Her gray cotton pantsuit, normally without a wrinkle or blemish, had a dark stain on the shoulder and a tiny rip at the sleeve. A large bottle of something I couldn't identify lay near her head. Jasper strained against his harness, obviously wanting to get closer, but I gently tugged him back. Percival stared at the body, his whiskers twitching, but he stayed parked next to my feet. My mouth went dry and I swallowed. What happened? Evan shook his head. I don't know. I mean, she was here when I opened up a few minutes ago. I glanced down to make sure the kitties were still sitting at my feet. This wouldn't be a good time for them to explore. Even though they were on leashes, they were sneaky enough to occasionally escape and would go their merry way. Okay, have you called the sheriff? No, I guess it hadn't sunk in what I was seeing. I'd only just found her when you walked in. I don't understand. How did she get in here? And what happened to her? He rubbed his forehead. Poor guy, he was obviously going into shock. I doubted his thoughts were making much sense right now. Do you want me to call him for you? He nodded. Yes, if you don't mind. I don't seem to be able to think clearly. Believe me, I understand. After having found one of my pet parents in a similar state a few months ago, I remember the feeling of shock, like my mind and body were sluggish, refusing to work properly. It had taken me a while. It had taken a while for me to have a coherent thought afterward. I dialed 911. The sheriff's assistant, Betsy Jones, answered. Sheriff's office, how may I help you? I kept a watchful eye on Evan as I spoke, hoping he wouldn't keel over right next to me. Hey, Betsy, it's Molly Stewart. I heard a smile in her voice when she said, Hi, Molly, how are you? Well, there's been an incident at Evan Lake's studio here, and long story short, Agnes Temple is dead. Silence came from the other end of the line, and then Betsy said, let me alert Sheriff King. He'll be there as soon as he can. Thank you. I ended the call, frowning at the phone. Betsy was normally so efficient, so professional when doing her job for the sheriff. Maybe I'd called her on a bad day, although she sounded cheery enough when I first called. Had she been friends with the deceased? I didn't know any connection between them, but in a small town it was hard to tell. So many citizens were related or had a past history, and the details came out later on. Like when somebody turned up dead, that always shook skeletons out of closets. Is the sheriff on his way? Evan asked, his face pale and hand shaking. I placed my phone back inside my purse, hanging its strap from my shoulder. Yes, Betsy said would be here as soon as he could. Evan nodded, but his pupils were dilated and a sheen of sweat shone on his face. Hey, I said, grabbing his hand, as he had done mine a few minutes earlier. Why don't we go outside and wait? Maybe get some fresh air. He'd still be in the same situation, but at least he wouldn't have to look at Agnes in her current state for a little while. Although, from what I had gone through, that image would play again and again in his mind for quite some time. Evan blinked. Air. Yes, air is good. He took a step and then faltered, grabbing onto my arm for support. Poor guy. It wasn't every day someone discovered a body in their workplace. While I'd been speaking to Evan, the cats had sidled closer to Agnes. Though they couldn't touch her because of their leashes, both had their necks stretched out, nostrils flaring as they tried to take in all the strange new smells. Jasper reached out his paw, but contracted only air. Percival didn't bother with trying to touch Agnes. Instead, he let out a long, loud hiss at the woman's body. Yeah, Kitty, that'll show her. Agnes hadn't been a nice woman. Even though Percival hadn't known her personally, he must have sensed that she hadn't been a human he would have liked. Or maybe he has simply because she was no longer breathing and it freaked him out. I never knew with cats. Once Evan had found his sea legs and didn't seem as wobbly or as confused, we headed toward the door. Percival came willingly, but Jasper needed convincing with a gentle tug on his leash. Finally, we all walked outside. Good morning, came from behind us. I jumped and turned, relieved to see Jillian Wells, my best friend. Hey, I said, I tilted my head toward Evan. What's going on? Jillian frowned in concern, pushing her long hair over one shoulder. Then she placed both hands on her hips, giving her signature stern look she'd perfected after years of scolding wayward library patrons. Waiting until two women passed us on the sidewalk, I leaned closer to Jillian and whispered, Evan just found a body in the— A body? She screeched. Not so loud, I whispered, not wanting anyone else passing by to know about the death before the sheriff got to hear. Sorry, who? Agnes Temple. Jillian's mouth dropped open. I just spoke to her yesterday. She came into the library to get some information on. She eyed Evan and then clammed up. On what? I asked. She shook her head, causing her long gold earrings to dance. I'll tell you later. What did she want to tell me about Evan? I looked in his direction, but he wasn't paying attention, still appearing befuddled and lost. Would he even notice we were talking about him? I tugged her to one side, a few feet away. Tell me what's going on. She glanced at Evan, seemed to make a decision, and then whispered. Agnes was in the library a couple of days ago. She asked for help using the internet on one of her computers. Okay, I said, that doesn't sound too strange. Some of our senior townspeople often needed assistance with the newer technology at the library. What strange was the subject matter she looked up. She typed in Evan's name. I frowned. Why would she do that? If they'd known each other, couldn't she have just asked him what she wanted to know? Jillian shrugged. Not sure. I wondered that too. But once she had what she needed, she told me in no uncertain terms to go away. I couldn't very well stand there and snoop. Her eyebrows lowered. I could have, but honestly, that woman scares me a little, and you know I don't scare easily. Well, I guess she's not so scary anymore. I glanced over at Agnes's still form. No, I guess not. Jillian stared at Evan for a few seconds, and then at me, shook her head, and let out a sigh. Without warning, Evan let out a loud gasp, headed our direction, and collapsed right into Jillian. She was quick enough to wrap her arms around him before he sunk to the sidewalk. My eyes widened as I rushed up to help her hold him up. The adrenaline after finding Agnes on his floor appeared to have left Evan feeling weak. A siren wailed as it turned the corner and headed in our direction. Naturally, it got everyone's attention who was walking nearby, and also those who were working or doing business in the surrounding buildings. Office and shop doors opened as people spilled out to see what the latest excitement was. In a small town, anything happening that was different was bound to add excitement to an otherwise quiet day. Sheriff Lawrence King opened his car door and stepped out, giving a wave to his impromptu audience, as if he were some sort of celebrity. When I glanced at Jillian, I caught her in the middle of an eye roll. I hadn't given one, but I wanted to. The sheriff rubbed me the wrong way, but that might be due to his hounding me during a previous murder when he all but accused my Uncle Russ of doing the deed. Thank goodness the real killer was apprehended and my uncle was spared any of that awfulness. Aside from that, Sheriff King also liked to ridicule my profession, a mobile cat groomer, as if what I did for a living wasn't valuable or worthwhile. I had a lot of kitties and their pet parents who would stand behind me and give me their support. Some of them might even purr. The sheriff adjusted his hat, hitched up his pants, and strolled over to us. He eyed us one by one. Evan, Jillian, Molly. When he glanced down, he let out a small gasp, taking 2 steps backwards. One more step and he would have tipped off the sidewalk and ended up on the street in a tan polyester covered lump. A tiny part of me wished, no, Molly, play nice. Besides, I knew the reason for his gasp and partial retreat. It was due to my furry little friends who were at that moment staring up at the sheriff. In the past, his actions made it clear he not only didn't like cats, but was afraid of them. After gaining his composure, the sheriff, while avoiding glancing down again, said, "What's the emergency here?" Betsy said something about a body. His voice was loud enough it carried down the sidewalk and across the street. A collective gasp sounded before pointing and whispering took over from those watching the developing spectacle. I shook my head, but what had I expected? Whitewater Valley liked spicy news, and it didn't get much spicier than murder. Wait, how did I know Agnes hadn't died accidentally? Was it because her body was crumpled in such an unnatural position and that she bled from a wound on her head, but the way she was lying, it hadn't appeared she had fallen against anything that had caused her injury? But mainly it was because, having previously discovered one of my pet parents murdered in his garden, I had the same strange vibe I had that day. Yep, I felt it in my bones. Agnes had been murdered. Evan was in some sort of stupor at the moment, unable to communicate. Jillian watched him. Was she wondering if you'd fallen her again? Apparently, it was up to me to answer the sheriff. You heard right, Sheriff, I said. There's a body in the photography studio. I lifted my head toward the front door. Who is it? He asked. Betsy wouldn't say. She just turned red and refused to look at me. Strange girl. The sheriff had no right to call anyone else strange. Why don't we go inside? I eyed the growing crowd. It looks like we're attracting a lot of attention. I didn't add that his yelling out about a dead body was a partial catalyst for the gathering, and also his use of car sirens. His frown told me he didn't like me making suggestions as to what he should do, but I didn't care. The sooner this was over, the better. I glanced at Evan, who was indeed leaning heavily on Jillian again. She had him held tight against her, expression of concern focused on her face. Sheriff King and I stepped inside and I motioned for him to follow me to the dark room. She's in there. He adjusted his hat, which had gone askew. Yep, I pointed toward the body. Agnes Temple. His eyes bulged out. Agnes? He quickly regained his composure and bent over to see her better. Next, he reached into his shirt pocket for a pair of gloves and put them on. He touched her neck, took in immediate surroundings, clicked some pictures with his cell phone, and then made a phone call. I could make out from his end of the conversation that he was speaking to Tyson Berry, our local funeral director, who doubled as our medical examiner. Tyson will be here soon, he said. Until then, why don't you tell me about what you know about all of this? His expression was one of judgment, and if I had something to do with how Agnes ended up here, cold as a pantsuit wearing mackerel. Hey, I said, I didn't have anything to do with what happened to her. Seems like you're protesting awfully loud for someone who's not involved. My free hand landed on my hip. Let's not go down that road again. What road would that be? His mouth formed into a smirk. He knew very well what road I referred to. He knew very well I referred to Whitewater Valley's previous murder. The one where you automatically assume I or someone I'm close to committed a murder. Close to? He turned his head toward the doorway. Yeah, you're really tight with that other girlie, the librarian, huh? Girlie? Honestly, the man was prehistoric troll. Jillian Wells is a close friend, yes. And the guy who runs this place. He pointed his thumb toward the entrance. You know his name is Evan Lakes. He shrugged. Doesn't matter what his name is. All I care about is finding out who did this. I need to go speak to both of them. Go invite them to join us, why don't you? I glanced toward the doorway to the main area. If I wanted to get to the bottom of Agnes's murder, what choice did I have? Might as well get this awfulness over with.